and welcome to a new video. Today I'm just so excited to be finally filming this. I have been thinking about doing this video for a very long period of time, and I'm very excited to be collaborating with some of my good friends who are Indian booktubers. But more on that later. First, I feel like we need to take a step back and tell you what the context of this video is going to be. So basically, if you have read like the description, it says that I will be reading Indian partition literature, which is correct. But before that, I feel like maybe we need to take another step back and be like, what is the partition? In case people do not know, okay, it could be a possibility. For those who live within the Indian subcontinent, it's very clear as to what the partition is. Basically, in 1947, when India and Pakistan won its independence from the British, it was essentially divided into two countries. India and Pakistan and Bangladesh were one, and then they were divided. So Pakistan became its own country, which was supposed to be majority for Muslims, and India was supposed to be the other country, which was supposed to be secular, but like, anyway, what then happened was that a lot of the people who were living in those areas, if they weren't from those religions, were like, for example, the Hindus who were living in the Pakistani area were coming to India, and the Muslims who were in India were moving to Pakistan. Yeah, that's basically during that time there were a lot of skirmishes, and by skirmishes I mean that more than 1 million people were killed. There were more than 10 million people who were migrating during this time. It was just one of the largest migratory experiences in the entire world, and it just had a lot of chaos with so many women being brutalized. More than 75,000 women were raped and killed during this period of time. It's a period of time that, even though it has been 70 years, it still lives very clearly in people's minds. For me particularly, I am Punjabi, so a lot of my family too were from that side of Punjab, which was now in Pakistan. So they did come here. They then moved to Jammu, which is like where I'm from now. And yeah, that's just it's you hear these stories all throughout, right? Like you keep hearing these stories of partition, of something that happened to them or something that happened to their families or their friends, and it's just something that you kind of grow up with. And it's just surprising that even though it has been 70 years, it's not quite left its hold on us. And I think that a lot of our experiences and the way that our culture currently is also very based on the experience that we had in our past, and that our generations before us also dealt with, and the sort of things that they kind of like, the baggage that they left down upon us, if that makes any sense to you. And I feel like it's important to understand this baggage and to see where they are coming from as well as to see the other perspective, to just kind of understand like what we're supposed to do, because I feel like you need to understand your past in order to better your future. And also, just like, I feel like with the partition there is a lot that has been unsaid. There are not many, for example, memorials or much which is there, because I feel like even though generations did talk about the partition just a little, a lot of them also don't want to talk about it, because there was just a lot of hurt and trauma from back then. But I feel like it is important to understand, because it was a huge part of our history. Now, that was a very large introduction, but you know what it is. Also, what I did not talk about is that when India and Pakistan were partitioned, there was also East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, and they got their independence in 1971. And what happens is that a lot of the times when we hear of partition stories, they primarily come from the Punjab being partitioned, but there are a lot of the parts where Bengal was also partitioned, and that's not really heard much of. So I'm going to try to rectify that in this vlog. You will see. But what is going to be super fun is that I have reached out to 3 of my favorite Indian booktubers, and I have asked them if they too want to be part of this collaboration of sorts where we are talking about partition literature. So, for example, Jyotsna from Jyotsna's Bookscapades is also reading non-fiction books where she's talking about the history and like the political climate and all of that of the partition and what happened during Indian independence struggle. There is Shruti from Fandom Newbie who is reading primarily fiction but from like these extremely esteemed authors. We have Sonali who's reading a mix of fiction and non-fiction, and that's going to be super fun. And then there's of course me. I am reading non-fiction, which is basically going to be about like stories of people. So it's about the people who actually went through stuff. That's the sort of non-fiction that I wanted to read. And yeah, that's what we're going to be doing. But also what's fun is that there is going to be a live show. There's going to be a live show on the 15th, which is the Indian Independence Day at 6 p.m. IST, and we are going to have like a quiz towards the end. Like, so we will be chatting, all four of us, and there will be like a quiz towards the end, which will be peppered in with information that you have seen in all of our videos. So if you watch all of our videos, then you'll get like answers to like the questions with that, and you'll be able to like get the books. You get what I mean, right? Anyway, so yeah, that's gonna be super duper fun. I'm really looking forward to that, and I hope that you will join us there. But for now, let me talk about the books that I'm going to be reading. So I'm going to be reading 3 books, and I don't know how I'm going to do that because I have only 48 hours till like this thing is supposed to be published, or like maybe 50 hours. So I'm reading 3 books. I'm going to talk about them, not at all. I'm just going to name them and then talk about them in detail when I when I start reading them. So the first book is this one, which is The Other Side of Silence by Urvashi Butalia. That's that. The second one is Inherited Memories, which is like a collection of memories and stories from people whose parents, etc., dealt with the partition, but on the Bengal side. So that is on the east of India, and what that was like. And then the third book is a book that is missing. Like, I'll show you the mess that is in my room right now. And it's here somewhere, like someone kept it in this mess, and I can't find it right now, but it is basically The Sixth River. It is a book that Aanchal Malhotra, who wrote Remnants of a Separation, Jyotsna is going to be talking about it in her video, but it's a book that I absolutely adore. And yeah, that's here somewhere. I'm going to find it, but essentially it's like journals of a person who was going through partition at that point of time. But yeah, that I'm going to find it and then I'll read it. Anyway.
That's not happening.
Editing Smriti here to let you know that I did not in fact read the third book. I am currently reading it but have not been able to finish it in order for me to tell you what I thought about it, etc, etc. It is still very good and I will talk about it in my wrap-ups perhaps or another video, but yeah, that's all. The first book that I am reading is this one, which is The Other Side of Silence by Urvashi Butalia. Now, this book was written in 97, which is quite a while ago. But essentially, Urvashi Butalia started writing this because her friends were making a movie or a documentary about the partition, and she decided to be like their researcher. So she started talking to people. She herself is Punjabi and from Delhi. So a lot of her family also came from Pakistan and were displaced, and then they were refugees in Delhi and made a life there. So she talks about her story in the beginning, which I've just sort of finished, as well as like many others who she interviewed along the way. And she felt throughout that what was interesting that about what I've read so far is some things that she's pointed out already, which I think is very interesting, which is that the way men talk about the partition and the way women talk about partition has been very different. For example, the men talk about the macro, which is the politics of the time, what was happening, who were the people who were calling the shots, etc. This is what happened. Whereas the women spoke about the minutia, the small details, things that were important to them. Like, for example, this child went missing, or like this girl was taken away, or something like that, that the men didn't really think of, but the women thought of these small things. So it was very interesting how memory played a role there. Also, a lot of this was then taken 50 years after the partition, so memory is a dangerous thing, but she said that memory is important because it also frames the way things were taken. So like there might be times where there was a lot of rage, but there were also times where people were supremely cagey because perhaps they did something. So it also kind of frames the idea of what was happening at that point of time, and I think that is also really interesting, the way that she thinks of it, at least. And so far, what I think is interesting is that I had read The Remnants of a Separation, which is essentially where she goes and gets stories of people who moved, right, during the partition, that is from India to Pakistan, or like from India to Pakistan, or from the Pakistan area to India, and got their stories as to like what was the material memory that they carried with them, and how does that kind of tell you the story of their lives then. And she has done something very similar, but like 20 years before, where she talks to people about their experiences and what their life was before, as well as just like during. And I think that it is really, really interesting. She, of course, at that point in time did not have the resources to be able to go to Pakistan, though in the very first story, she tells you the story of her uncle, who like she got to go to Pakistan and meet her uncle, like basically her mother's brother, who didn't come to India, but chose to stay in their hometown in Lahore, in Pakistan, and convert, and what his life was like afterwards. And yeah, it's just really, really interesting. I and yeah, it's made me think a lot so far. I'm really liking the way that it is written. It is simple. I have been highlighting stuff because it's important to me. And yeah, I will come back to you with more thoughts once like I finish more of this book. Hi, hello, welcome. I finished the book and I have a lot to say. This book packs a punch in terms of the amount of information that it gives you about the partition. There are a lot of things that I absolutely had no idea about, but what I really appreciate about this book is that it really tries to talk to people that usually were not spoken to when it came to the partition. So these are primarily women, children, and people on the margins. So, for example, Dalits, or the Harijans as they were called, or like the Christians, even like people who really weren't spoken to as much when it came to the partition. Now, what you last saw me speak about was of her own experience with the partition, with her uncle, etc. After that, we went into facts. Now, with facts, why we put it in that is because there are a lot of things that we still don't know. So the numbers, etc., that we have are still not very accurate because it was a time of utter chaos. That was the number one thing that stood out for me. That was just the amount of confusion and chaos and panic that was happening during that time, because people just didn't know what was happening. Like even when Cyril Radcliffe, the person who drew the Radcliffe lines, which are the lines that partition are like countries, right? He was given 5 weeks to do that entire thing. That's crazy. How do you partition and make three countries and draw their like geographical lines and give that person only 5 weeks to do it? That's insane. I mean, what? And then just like there were so many other like incidents where people were talking about things like what's going to happen to our provident fund and what's going to happen to the loans that we've taken and all of that sort of stuff, which like I didn't even think of that, but like that's probably something that they were thinking of. They were just like, like what happens to our salary and all the money that we've put in? Because if we're going to go into another country, what happens to that? And then I've taken what's it called, notes. Then there were things which like were really interesting because like there were files that were there and they had to be copies of them, right? Like in terms of like the administrative thing, in terms of the government, like they had to make files and copies, but they didn't have like I don't know, Xerox stuff at that point of time. So literally there were people for months from the Pakistan admin like government who had to sit and just take notes and like just copy down everything by hand, which is like what? And then there's another really fascinating thing, that is that when Pakistan was created, they didn't have their own currency. So for an entire year, they worked on like Indian currency, and then in July 1948 is when they got their own State Bank of Pakistan, which is when they had their own currency that was made. And I'm just like, this really was not like very thought out, and obviously this is why there was just so much of chaos and people are just like, what is going on? Like yeah, it's absolutely nuts. Just there were so many other things as well that were part of this, that just really like blew my mind, where I just wasn't aware of so many of these things. And I feel like I tried to read a lot of partition literature and try to like know a lot about that time. So yeah, the next part was essentially like a two-part thing, which was about women and honor, and these two parts just really infuriated the living shit out of me. Like I had to take a break after a while, because even though I knew some of these stories that were told in like fictionalized formats, etc., to hear it in like it's actually happened is insane. Because essentially what has happened is that women, first of all, they did not get to have too many conversations with women because the men were always there in the room, or the women were never really spoken of, or that they themselves did not feel like their voice mattered, or that they just didn't want to talk about what happened to them then, which is like understandable. Like why would you want to talk about like rape or abductions or things that you went through at that time and dredge up all of that stuff? So like Urvashi Butalia herself was like, she didn't know how to do these things, because obviously, why would you want to make a person go through something that they don't want to go through again? So getting those stories obviously was just not possible. So we just don't have that sort of information. But also, it's just so sad that women don't think that their own voices sort of matter. However, what she did say, which I mentioned previously, was just the sort of things that women remember were just way different than what, say, the men remembered, which is just very interesting. And I apologize for the background noise because there's a lot of construction going on, I don't know, in people's houses around me. But another thing that I really, really, really struggled with was the whole concept of purity, because there were so many women, like 75,000 plus women who were abducted, on both sides, on Pakistan and from India. And like they were either raped and killed, or they were made to become like wives of the people who abducted them, or like just keep them with them, and uh, and a lot of them got pregnant. What also really, really, really bothered me is the way that the men in India especially spoke about getting their women back, and like the whole morality aspect of it. Because even when it came to fighting for women, it was taken in the narrative of how this looks for the men. Because I will essentially read out this one part. Only then would moral order be restored and the nation made whole again, and only then, as the organizer, which was like a magazine, points out again and again, would the emasculated, weakened manhood of the Hindu male be vindicated. Because this is kind of like they kept talking about Ram and Sita, and we have to fight to get our women back. But that's essentially what even like the Ramayana was about. Like we're getting into that, but not really. Where it was like, oh, this is pride. This is like, oh, and then the third part is that of the people in the margins, or the Dalits, or the Christians, or whatever. But essentially, the Dalits, she got to interview only like one person, but she had a lot of like archival information as well, which I thought was very interesting. But it's essentially like the Dalits and the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, etc., they didn't really get affected as much during this time in terms of that they weren't brutalized, or like they weren't part of these massacres or mass rapes that happened, because people knew who they were. Because essentially the people who were killing other Muslims or Hindus or whatever, they knew who they were killing. So they knew that since these people are Dalits, they're like, it's fine, we don't want to kill you. Because they either thought that like these people aren't even like worth it, or they're not like part of the Hindu religion per se or whatever, or that they felt like without these people, our stuff won't be able to happen. Because the Dalits at that point of time especially were the people who handle things like sanitation or cremations or births of people and stuff like that. They were doing the jobs that the others did not want to do. So they honestly like looked at it from that perspective as well. And it just led me to this point, which was really, really like I was shocked by it. So it says large number of Harijans then remained in transit camp waiting to leave, which is from Karachi. They wanted to come from Pakistan side to India. The absence resulted in a breakdown of Karachi's sanitation and cleaning system. Under pressure, the government of Sindh passed a legislation, the Essential Service Maintenance Act, which is ESMA, which disallowed Harijans from leaving the country. Like, can you imagine? They didn't allow them to leave because they were like, who's going to handle our sanitation? Because you're the ones who used to handle it, and now we can't because. And even the Dalits or the Harijans or the scheduled caste or scheduled tribe people who did manage to come back, they weren't allowed into these relief camps because the people who were managing them were like, we don't want you in the same area as like the others of the upper caste, which is ridiculous. Anyway, point is, I learned a lot. I learned quite a lot from this book. It just made me think quite a bit, and I just, yeah, everyone should read this book. I do have to say that the writing was all right. However, there were parts where I got slightly annoyed because there were excerpts of an interview that was given first and then the entire interview was given later, so it felt a little like repetitive, or there were parts of an interview that was in another section that you read again in another section, so that was a little bit annoying, I do have to say. However, the amount of information and the amount of just like information that we get in this book is important, and I think that it really just changed the way that I looked at things. It made me think of things that I hadn't thought of before, and yeah, definitely recommend. And now I'm gonna stop talking and read my next book. Hello and welcome to another day where there is still construction going on downstairs. So if you hear anything, apologies, but like listen to the sound of my voice. My voice. But yeah, I finished this book, which is The Inherited Memories, and I really enjoyed it. However, I do have to say that it's interesting that this book was published by Zuban, which is founded by Urvashi Butalia, who is the author of the previous book that I read. So interesting, like just the way that worked, right? But yeah, if you haven't heard of Zuban, please do check them out. So what this book is about is essentially that this is what we were talking about, right? Like that the East doesn't really have too many stories, but the West does. And that's because what I found out is that in the 90s is when they were trying to collect all of this information of the partition because of the 50th anniversary of our independence, etc. And at that point of time, Bangladesh had its own like 25-year-old anniversary thing coming up, so they didn't really like look at that information at that point of time. They didn't really want that pressed at that point of time. But also it was tough to do this in the East because not only was there the partition in the 47, like in 47 where like there was East Pakistan that was made, but also in 71 when Bangladesh was made. So there were a lot of people who went to Bangladesh who then like came back, and there was like a whole exodus, and there were like, you know, like it was a long complicated process. So even this book is not just about the partition in 47, it's also about 71. For them, it's just you cannot separate these two events. They are very much linked. Which I thought was very interesting. And essentially what these people did was that they spoke to third generation of people who were like went during the partition, that were affected during the partition, because it is said that memories skip a generation, because parents don't really tell their children so much, but grandparents do tell their grandchildren stories. And I guess that's interesting because yeah, that's just an interesting tidbit for you, which when you think about it, it is true. Anyway, so yeah, it's interesting because what this book tries to do is try to understand whether the children and the grandchildren themselves also kind of inherit this trauma. And they say that yes, it does, because it kind of makes you the sort of person that you are, but it also makes you define the other, which is like the enemy or who the other person was. You have these preconceived notions, etc., that you kind of make because of the experiences that your grandparents tell you about as a child. And yeah, that's just very, very interesting to me. But yeah, again, I really enjoyed this book. This book wasn't full of just like traumas, etc., because I'm sure that a lot of these things weren't really spoken about. So for example, it doesn't mention anything to do with women's violence, etc., which was like a huge trigger point for me in the previous book. This obviously was not mentioned at all during this time, just very vaguely perhaps. But yeah, because obviously at this point in time, this is not something that like grandparents, etc., want to talk to their children about. So it is kind of sad that we don't get to hear those stories, but it is what it is, I guess. However, what was also interesting was that these memories that these children had or these grandchildren had, etc., they are also like not only just trauma, it is also like interesting fun stories as well that were mixed into this. So which is why this book was like way more pleasurable to read, because you got to like see these fun like marriage things and all of that sort of stuff. So that was definitely a plus. Also, I felt like this book was like edited a little better, I guess, because like 25 years, I guess, you learn more from like how to do things, I guess. But yeah, I have notes, so like essentially what I also saw in this book was that we saw essentially two sides of the story. One is of the people who went from India to Bangladesh, and then there were the people who then left Bangladesh and came back. Another thing that I thought was really interesting, which I didn't really think about too much, was that it wasn't just the Bengalis who, like the Muslim Bengalis who went, but also the states nearby. So for example, there was a huge portion of Biharis, people like Muslims from Bihar, who moved to East Pakistan, because they thought that that was going to be their state. But when the Bangladesh independence happened, it was basically about the Urdu speaking versus the Bengali speaking. So the Urdu speaking people then had to move back, and they were sort of displaced again. So it was like sort of a double displacement that they got, and that was just very interesting, because the people who had to come back, I feel like there was more like violence, etc., on their end, and I feel like there were more stories with regards to that. Yeah. I also did notice that the people in Bangladesh, they are more like people who long for family. Like they are the ones who keep thinking about like the Indian families that were left behind, or like wanted to get in touch with them. They spoke about it much more. So I found that to be super interesting. And just generally, I thought that this book did a really good job in giving you an understanding of how things went about, but in this very like simple storytelling sort of manner, which was very easy to read and fun at times as well, because as I said, like fun stories and stuff like that. And yeah, I would definitely recommend. You can buy the book only on the Zuban website, so I would definitely recommend doing that. And yeah, I definitely do plan to read much more about the East partition. So if you have any recommendations of books that will give me that knowledge, please do comment down below and let me know. I would be really interested to do that. A book that I can give you a recommendation if you want to understand the Bangladeshi independence, but in a very simple way, is this young adult book called I Remember Abbu by Humayun Azad. It is just lovely. Check it out, it's great. But yeah, what I also really loved about this book was the amount of recommendations and book recommendations that I got along the way. And also with the previous book, when she spoke about various people doing various things, I wanted to read more. So for example, I've already bought Anis Kidwai's autobiography and memoir, because she was a social worker at that time, and she spoke about her social work and the 2 years post the partition and what all like sort of she went through and what all the things that she saw and did. So yeah, so that was really interesting, where it's really put me down this rabbit hole of wanting to read all of these books. And if you too are interested, then do check out my other collaborators in this thing that we have done, and check out their videos, because they have also read a lot of books with regards to the partition, and they also have a lot to say. We have been chatting on WhatsApp, and just like it's going to be just a really interesting time. I am so glad that I did this collab, and that we read this all of these books, because I think that they are really important, and that like it's really opened our eyes, honestly, to all of the things that we didn't know, and to the history that we have. So yeah, again, thank you so much for watching. However, I do want to say that we have a live show on the 15th, where we are going to be talking more together. So I do hope that you join us, because there will also be like a giveaway of sorts, where we are going to be gifting people like books that we read. So it's up to you, your choice. You get to choose the books that you want from the list of the books that like all four of us read. There's gonna be a quiz, and it's just gonna be a fun time. So definitely do join us on the 15th for that. But yeah, apart from that, I just have to say that the partition in like this book that I read, the end basically talks about how partition as a word is not quite enough to describe what actually happened, because when you look at the word partition, it is essentially just like partition of geographies, right? Like it's a geographical partition, if you get what I mean. But it was so much more than that, and you can't really quite put it into words. And I guess these books do do a great job of trying to put that together and trying to put these memories and facts and all of that together. But it is like our duty to kind of understand what was happening, and just kind of educate ourselves so that we can build a better future, understand our culture a little more perhaps, and that's all I have to say. Anyway, I hope that you are all doing good. Please do watch all of my collaborators videos. I will link all of them down below. Follow them as well, and I will see you hopefully on the 15th. It's going to be so much fun. Happy Independence Day. Just yes, bye.